Good evening. Thank you everyone for being here tonight as we continue the Meet the Author series here at Darien Library. My name is Mallory Aarons and I'm the head of adult programming here. Again, welcome. Programs at the library are made possible by contributions to our annual Friends of the Library campaign. Thank you for your continued support to make our collections and programs available to the community. I would like to thank Rosanna Neeson at Barrett Bookstore for making this event possible. Margaret Sapier of Wave Hill Bread's Bakery and Cafe provided some of the samples that we hope you'll stay and enjoy after the presentation. In preparing for tonight's event, I made what I thought to be a simple request from my fellow colleagues. I asked them to prepare a dish from Dana's cookbook, Mastering My Mistakes in the Kitchen. I figured, hey, the First Lady of Food herself has made a few mistakes, owned them, learned from them, and then given us the recipe to improve upon them. Well, my spice nuts burnt. Stephanie made cucumber kimchi in our staff lounge where there was no food processor and there was certainly no Korean chili flakes. Kathy's no-fail brand muffins yielded about double the amount that Dana suggested, and Tina's poor pear upside-down cake collapsed upon itself. I'm not sure we've mastered the mistakes just yet, but we certainly had a good time doing it. Tonight's guest has been covering the world of food, wine, style, and design as Food and Wine's editor-in-chief since 1995. She sits on the board of directors of City Harvest, a New York City hunger relief organization. Wholesome Way Foundation, dedicated to providing access to sustainable foods, and Hot Bread Kitchen, an organization that helps train low-income men and women to join the culinary workforce. In 2012, she was an inductee into the James Beard Foundation Who's Who in Food and Beverage in America. Please join me in welcoming to the library, Dana Cowin.
Thank you, Mallory. I'm not sure, the thing about my cookbook is that the recipes work, it's just the humans that are fallible, and that's just such a frustrating lesson to learn. Like when I listen to you talk about the challenges you and your coworkers had, I immediately go into psychoanalytic mode, which is to say, if you burnt the spiced nuts, what else were you doing when you were making those nuts? I'm totally serious. What were you doing?
Not in the kitchen, I'll tell you that.
She wasn't in the kitchen. This is a problem. That upside down pear cake, which honestly is one of the easiest things to make in the history of time. Why do you think that didn't work?
Well, we talked about this.
We did, that's why I'm asking you.
So we had a second pair upside down cake. So Tina, who, the collapsible one last night, she cooked another one this morning. And what happened, I was telling Dana before, is that she looked at it, there was 15 minutes left, and it looked brown. It looked great. She poked it, looked okay. Takes it out of the oven about 10 minutes before it was supposed to come out. Flipped it over, and then boom, sank. All of her hopes and dreams.
They cratered along with the cake. But the thing is, so these two examples are actually unbelievably good examples of what I learned in doing this book. Lesson number one is you have to focus, like if you're in the kitchen cooking, actually, if you're cooking, you need to be in the kitchen. And so that was the first lesson. And the second one is, if you don't have good instincts, don't pay attention to them. So if the cake looks brown, but the recipe says, like, it needs 10 more minutes, it probably needs 10 more minutes. I don't know. But I was very happy to hear that, that it worked out the next time. So that was really good. So I wrote this book. Does anyone on that side want to squidgle in a little? I'm not going to push you or anything, but just...
You don't want to get us to that point.
Well, I want to be sure, I feel very inclusive, but I also know that I never sat in the front row, ever. You always sat in the front row, didn't you? Yeah. That's a personality type. So when I set out to do this book, I thought, well, I don't really cook all that well, and I should, because I've been the editor-in-chief of Food and Wine for 20 years. Like, that just seems like a baseline that I should be able to cook. And so that was the task I set myself. I was going to learn to cook. However, what I discovered, having now written this book and spent 2 years like absorbing its lessons, like don't use your intuition if you don't have any, I realized that what I actually wrote was the autobiography of my life through failure. And then, instead of just looking at cooking as a failure, I'm like, oh my gosh, actually, if I look at every single part of my life, I have failed at the same time I've succeeded. And I dissected everything I'd ever done and realized this is just completely a trend. So this part worked out for me. I graduated from college, and the day that I graduated from college, I got a job at Vogue magazine. That was awesome, particularly because it didn't start for 2 months. So I had the entire summer to do whatever I wanted. That was really great. But at Vogue, I discovered that if you're going to be successful, you actually need to be a line editor. So you know what that means? Like, so if you have a piece of copy, text, you have to be able to fix the sentences. And I was really not good at fixing the sentences. So I was so sad and depressed, and every day I'd go in and say, I'm not getting anywhere. I've been here for 4 years, and I'm still doing expense reports, and other things I had progressed at. I was writing captions, for example. That was very exciting. But I couldn't line edit. So after a lot of soul-searching conversations with my parents, I quit. So I call that mishap number 1. Like, oops, can't line edit, need to leave job. So I went and did something else, thinking I would be a writer because I love to write, but that turns out to be much harder than anything else in this world. So I luckily got a job at House and Garden, which was fantastic. The person who had been my boss at Vogue went to House and Garden. She knew me, she liked me. Everything was fantastic. I had the strangest job. It didn't involve any line editing. It was really, this is where I say, if you have any cell phones, do you want to turn them to silent? If you know how to do that, which, anyway, so House and Garden, amazing. The woman who got me there, the woman who I worked for at Vogue, was there. She thought it was great. I could avoid line editing. I just produced big picture, pretty stories. And then she left. Oh. And the woman who was the editor-in-chief was like, I know you want to go follow, the person who brought you here. I know she's offered you a job. And I was like, actually, she didn't offer me a job, and I really like it here. She's like, well, I'm sure you'd like to get a different job. And I was like, no, actually, I really like it here. And she tried so hard to fire me, but I refused to be fired. And then instead of firing me, she gave me this gigantic promotion from second most junior job to managing editor. That means I skipped all of the line editing I didn't know how to do, which was so lucky. Awesome. And then, boom, House and Garden folded. I was the folding managing editor of House and Garden. I was the one who told all the staff, sorry, there's no, we're closing. Yeah. So that was sort of another mishap. And then I went, Connie Nast, which is the company that owns both Vogue and House and Garden, found another job for me. Yay! And I went to Mademoiselle. Zits, dates, boys. I have interest in boys, but nothing in zits and dates. And that was just that was misdirection. Like, I couldn't stand the job. And in fact, I have no ability to hide my feelings. So I would sit in meetings and I'd roll my eyes, and I would make these faces. And the editor-in-chief called me in and she was like, if you don't like it here, you should get another job. And if you do like it here, then you should stop making all those ridiculous faces. So I said, okay, I think I'll get another job. So I got another job, but I would say those were a lot of problems. Those were a lot of failures. Then I went to interview at Food and Wine, and he said, so why do you think you should be the editor of Food and Wine? I It's like, well, because I know an enormous amount about lifestyle. You know, I worked at a fashion magazine and did features. I worked at a house magazine. I know, so I know what people put into their kitchens. I know how they entertain. I know how they dress when they're cooking and eating out. And I think all of that's actually important for a food lifestyle publication. And you at Food and Wine Magazine have a lot of people who are really talented in the area of food. So you don't need me to know so much about food, which was actually, now that I think of it, sort of ballsy and not completely accurate. But that is what led me to be able to write a book called Mastering My Mistakes in the Kitchen, because truly there was nothing I had done so like if you count that up, that was 10 years of my life that involved no cooking at all. And then I got this great job where I did not need to cook. So I focused on magazine making, which was really, really fabulous, and then of course, like I got there and I just put together a magazine, and then I took on Food and Wine books, so I oversee the books, and then the web came along, so I took on the web, and then tablets came along, took on the tablets, and then social media came along, whatever. None of that, let me tell you, requires the editor to be a cook. So I'm just going to, that's just a little background. I thought I would read you a little bit of the intro to my book, and then, which will tell you even more of the story. And then you can ask me questions that, assuming that some are about cooking and some are not, I will be able to answer. I'm going to be honest, I am not a great cook. As the longtime editor-in-chief of Food and Wine Magazine, I've learned a lot about food by eating in extraordinary restaurants, tasting recipes in our test kitchen daily, and talking to chefs. So let's just say, my job is going around the world and going to the best restaurants. It's pretty good, but you don't need to cook to do that. And my office is test kitchen adjacent. So like, I sit here, and the test kitchen is like where the exit sign is. And every day, several times a day, someone comes into my office and puts food on my desk for me to taste, because for me to get up and actually go to the kitchen takes more time than I have, because I'm not line editing, but doing something else. So yet despite all that, there is one culinary area in which I am not an expert, and that is hands-on cooking. I've messed up literally every type of food, meat, fish, chicken, bread, pie, using every kind of technique: roasting, grilling, broiling, boiling, at every time of day: breakfast, lunch, dinner, snack time, and I'm always surprised by my mistakes. Particularly by the standards of today's foodies, I am not an adventurous cook. I mean, I am not roasting a pig, right? I mean, how many people have one of those La Cucina boxes? Not me. Apparently not you either, but many people in the foodie world do. I gravitate towards straightforward recipes with a high yum factor, a shortish ingredient list, and a smart, simple trick that makes the dish seem special. Now, I come by my incompetence genetically. I am descended from a long line of non-cooks. My mother goes out for dinner or cocktails 7 nights a week. She does serve one family meal. I said serve. I didn't say cook. She hosts our annual Thanksgiving feast. And to the best of my knowledge, she has never actually considered cooking it herself. She has it delivered by a very good local takeout shop, and instead devotes herself to the whimsical touches. She found years ago paper turkeys that with the expandable belly and the little tag on them. So she, has those and our names written on them. She puts them out every year. She puts them away every year. She takes them out. On the front door, there's a big, shiny foil turkey. She also is spectacular at getting desserts. So she lives in New York City. I live in New York City. She goes up and down Madison Avenue. EAT has a great pie. William Greenberg has great cake. And Mitchell London, from whom she gets the rest of the Thanksgiving meal, also does some fabulous desserts. I mean, we have a table of 9 desserts. And, 1 turkey, 1 side, and like the rest of the meal does not get a whole lot of attention. I wasn't one of those kids who compensated for their parents' lack of interest in food preparation by learning to cook for myself. My friend Caroline from grade school remembers the time when we were 11 and I burned the Formica countertop in the kitchen by putting a hot pan of popcorn directly on the countertop. Now, the popcorn, let me just tell you, was perfectly cooked. It just hadn't occurred to me that if you put a hot pan on Formica, it would explode, which is exactly what it did. The incident is seared in my memory, but apparently I had forgotten one small detail. I asked Caroline to tell my parents that she was the one who scorched the counter so I wouldn't get in trouble. My friend Dana remembers a time during college when we were peeling apples side by side, as one does in college, and I marveled at her ability to remove the peel all in one go. You know, the person who goes like this? Yeah. I was like, it was a hackathon. You know, today a hackathon has a different meaning, but it was my apples were a patchwork of hack marks, bald spots, and red skin. And so what I'm saying, I guess, is that I am not a natural. It's not like when I got to the kitchen, it all worked out for me. Once I got to food and wine in my mid-30s, I did begin experimenting in the kitchen. On occasional Saturday nights, I'd make dinner for friends, hoping one of them might bring an eligible, single guy along. I could edit that. Eligible and single, that's the same thing. Although maybe eligible means he has better qualities than just being single. In the office the next week, I'd share my party disasters with the test kitchen cooks and Tina Ulaki, the executive food editor. They were always very gracious and very encouraging, offering advice, easier recipes, suggestions for equipment that would make any dish foolproof. They insisted that mistakes were not my fault. I really wasn't so sure. Tina and I created a column for the magazine in which I recounted my kitchen mistakes, and she fixed them. At the time, though, I was too embarrassed to let the world know about all of my failures, from lumpy crepes to hopeless beef stews. So I used a pseudonym, Irma, a little inside joke referring to who knows who Irma could have been. Irma Rombauer, who wrote The Joy of Cooking. I just thought that was a little funny, you know, haha. I didn't have so much joy cooking, but Irma certainly did. I love the idea of the real Irma needing help in the kitchen. But over time, something changed. I figured out how to make certain recipes without failing. Some involved nothing more than chopping, tossing, and assembling. And those successes were very satisfying. And I've shared many of them in this book. I also realized it was important to me to come clean about my failures and address my incompetence. That was more important to me than hiding my inadequacy. Good cooking begins with honesty, which would mean admitting I burned that Formica countertop. I hope my mother reads this book. She has the book, but I'm not really sure she's read the book. And so began my journey to master my mistakes and to become a better cook. Who better to teach me than the talented chefs whose restaurant meals have been an education in myself? So I asked some of my chef friends to help me with my favorite recipes. Like, I don't want to conquer their recipes, like, that's fine for them, but I'm like, hey, I have recipes that I really like, that I want your help with. So they said yes, clearly. There were 65 chefs in the book. I asked 66. There was one person who was like, sorry, I'm really too busy. But everybody else was really enthusiastic about it. So as I look back at all the mistakes I've made, I'm amazed that I didn't stop cooking altogether. But the desire to get people together, to share a meal, overcame any reluctance to cook or any embarrassment about a less than perfect dish. So when I got into the kitchen with these talented chefs, I learned technique. But I learned something about myself, too. When seafood expert Eric Repair, the chef at one of America's best restaurants, Le Bernardin, has anyone been? It's amazing. I'm not allowed to say, but it's my favorite restaurant in America. And he taught me the humane way to kill a lobster. How many people know the humane way to kill a lobster? Okay, the humane way to kill a lobster is like humane for the animal, but not for the human. Because you take a big, gigantic knife, well in my case, it was a gigantic knife, and you cut the spinal cord, and then the lobster feels no pain. Well, I felt a lot of pain as I was doing this because the knife was very large, and there was a video. It was the only day I had video in the studio the entire time that I shot my book. And there was a photographer, and there was a crew, and there's Eric Repair. Like, why do I want to be cutting a lobster like with a very large knife in front of Eric Repair? I don't. And so there's actually a funny picture. Let's see if I can find it. Of me cutting the. So let me just tell you, it was hard. And that's what I said to Eric Repair. I said, Eric, this is actually really hard to do. And he looked at me and he said, no. He said, you are stronger than the shell of a lobster. And I was like, I'm really not so sure about that. I had a really, really hard time with the lobster shell. And he looked at me again and he said, oh, here, this is the, okay. So this is Eric and me trying to humanely kill the lobster. I got lobster juice all over him. He's like, Dana, my shirt, it's the only one I have. I was like, oh, well, sorry. It's okay, it's very authentic. Anyway, so Eric said, your mind was everywhere but the tip of the knife. And I was like, ooh. And at that minute, I was completely transparent to him. Like, he saw something that I had no idea. I mean, I really personally thought that I had worked very hard to kill that lobster, but no, I really was not focused. I was concerned about all those things I just told you. I was concerned about the videographer. I was concerned about the photographer. I was concerned about Eric. I was concerned that the shell was too hard. I was concerned that the knife was too big. I was concerned it just was not going to happen. And what I should have done is I should have just focused quietly on the knife, cut all that noise out, and just done the deed. So, blah, 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 blah. He made it clear that one of the most critical skills in cooking is learning to focus. When I was in the kitchen with Kristen Kish, the winner of Top Chef Season 10, how many people watch Top Chef? Yeah, Top Chef is so much fun. So I get to go on once a season, and that's great. And I knew Kristen from Top Chef, and she was at my house, and we were cooking. And we were making a chicken stew. And I was browning the chicken. But, it's going into a stew, for heaven's sakes. So I I kind of seared it, and I was ready to turn it. And she's like, no. And I was like, yeah, it's just going into the stew. She's like, no. So she was making me be really patient. I saw no need. It seemed like a waste of time. I had 2 small children who were like, can we have pasta? Like, what's happening with the chicken? So I kept saying, it was my turn to be like the kid. I'm like, is it ready yet? Is it ready yet? Is it ready yet? And she's like, no. And then the skin had browned enough on the skin side, and I'm like, that's great. And I flip it to the other side. She's like, no. You have to do the edges. I'm like, the edges? Why do I have to do the edges? There's the front and the back, but then there's the side. So you stand with your hot pan with, thank you, tongs. But they're not. They're tongs. They're tongs. Okay, with tongs, and you sear it, and you hold. I'm thinking, don't I though? But no. And you stand there with it searing the side. And you stand there, and you stand there, and you stand there. It was really tiresome. But she insisted that shortcuts would affect the final taste, and so I was like, okay, fine. So, no shortcuts. Another lesson, no shortcuts. At Food and Wine, we try to make the recipes as streamlined as possible. And when I wrote these, I took a lot of steps out that I thought would not affect flavor and would make it much more efficient for any home cook. But when you get the chefs in the kitchen, they add those little steps back in. They're not very tolerant of those workarounds. So Dave Chang, the genius behind the Momofuku Empire, taught me another life lesson when we were making kimchi. So where's Mallory? There was a kimchi problem. I want to know all about it. So he explained, so Dave and I were in the kitchen. How many people have been to one of the Momofukus? Noodle bar. It's the greatest thing if you're ever in the city. It's basically great for little kids all the way up to older kids, and then it gets very loud. But it's one of my favorite places, and I take my kids there for their birthdays every year. So we're making kimchi. It involves cucumbers. Now, the one that I did for the book is a quick kimchi. Like, you cut the cucumbers, you toss them, you can eat them in half an hour. But Dave, actually, though he doesn't necessarily seem like it, is a ridiculous overachiever. And so he came in the kitchen and he's like, no, we can do the quick kimchi, but we're also going to do a 1-month kimchi and we're going to do a 3-month kimchi. And I'm like, really? Like, how much time do you have? But he had enough time. So we did the quick kimchi, and then we start on the month-long kimchi. The month-long kimchi involves taking the cucumber, and he told me to make 4 cuts. Okay, I was ready for that, because the week before I'd been in the kitchen with this really great cook, not a chef, and we were cutting garlic, and he cut them. It was so beautiful because he had this little garlic, and then he had this really little knife, and then he cut 4 slits like this, and then he was mincing the garlic, right? So he had the 4, and then he went this way. Gorgeous. Well, so I'm like, oh, the cucumber. I'm going to do that with the cucumber. And so I cut it, and I cut it, and I cut it, and then Dave was over on his side making his cuts in his cucumber to make his kimchi, and he came over and was like, what are you doing? He was really dumbfounded. He might have been the most shocked of all the chefs that I cooked with. He's like, what did you do? I'm like, you told me to make 4 cuts. And he said, how are you going to stuff what you just cut? And I'm like, well, I wasn't really thinking of that. I was thinking about the lesson that I learned with the garlic, which is where you make 4 little parallel cuts. That's how I know that when you can't misapply, you can't apply one lesson to something that the lesson was not intended for, because I did that myself. So when he said 4 cuts, it was across, 1 cut and 1 cut. And if you do a cross, you can stuff into the cross. Okay, so fingers are very hard to stuff. I had cucumber fingers. He tried, like he really valiantly tried, but they're really, the ends like fell out, and I mean, as far as I was concerned, it was all getting stuffed into a jar anyway and being put on the shelf for a month, so it was okay. And it was okay. But he did teach me that in life, as in the kitchen, you always need to listen and not make assumptions. So the chef lessons really did turn into life lessons. And now when I cook, I hear the chefs in my head, and they're saying, slow down, stay focused. But I also hear them talking to me at other times. When I'm with my family, say, or in a meeting, I apply what I learned from them in the kitchen to every aspect of my life. Be present, pay attention, listen, and have patience. Now, here, if I could line edit this, I say, I apply. That would mean that I'm successful at it. I would just modify that, having, really taken on these lessons, and I say, I try to apply. Because it turns out that it's characterological. Impatience, lack of focus, it's something that, I really probably need more than cooking lessons. I need meditation lessons, and then maybe I will, be able to say, I apply, not I try to apply. So that was the journey. It was so much fun to do this book. It was so much fun to do this book because I loved cooking for my family and friends, in recreating all of the food that I've made truly since I had made perfect popcorn but burned the counter, to the cooking for my, my father died 24 years ago, and when he died, I wasn't that old, although I wasn't that young either. to be fair. But I never really cooked for him because I didn't grow up in a family where that was an important thing to do. We would, if we had gatherings, we would go out. But there was one meal where my father did come over and I made him dinner. And I made the family dinner. And I made asparagus. And it was sort of the height of Nouvelle Cuisine. And I made what I consider to be absolutely perfect asparagus. And he took one bite and he's like, I think you didn't cook these. And I was like, no, they're perfect. And he's like, I think that you might, I don't know about that. I actually like my asparagus cooked. I'm like, no. So, that is seared in my memory. It's probably like my autobiography. Like when I think of my life, I don't think necessarily of my life through food, but there are these moments that are so poignant and important. It's the only time I cooked for him. And I argued with him over how the asparagus were cooked. And now I'm doing this book I called Alice Waters, and I was like, so Alice, how do you cook your asparagus? And of course, Alice Waters, the chef at Chez Panisse, who's a maverick and changed all of our thoughts about what we now call farm to table, but sort of bring a French model to America. And I said, so how do you cook your asparagus? And she's like, you know what I hate? I hate it when people undercook the asparagus. Alice, where were you? Where were you when I was 32? And, not quite working at Food and Wine magazine. So, there's that moment, or I had so many people along the way who were amazing mentors to me. There was someone who was at Vogue who was a mentor, someone who was at House and Garden, someone who was at Food and Wine, and I invited them all to dinner. You'd think I would have figured out that wasn't really necessarily the best thing. I didn't have a stove that worked because I put a priority on design over functionality. And my stove was, and I put effort into getting the stove. It was a fabulous 1950 stove that when a friend of mine's grandmother moved to a nursing home, I got her original stove. The problem was that it didn't have an automatic ignition, and so Con Ed wouldn't hook it up for me, because you need to have and then I didn't want to get it refurbished. So so I cooked the dinner in a microwave. And this was like early days in the microwave. And so, just think about this. 4 Cornish hen, 1 microwave turntable. I also had hot plates. So I ended up serving them pasta and green beans, but not the Cornish hen. So, these moments that are, again, so memorable to me, I got to relive them in doing this book, and get them right. Like, how often do you get to really have a redo? And then how often do you get to have a redo with such good advice? And then how often do you I'm now really set up for success, I would hope. Because at least with these recipes, I have the keys to success, whether it is to pay attention. I mean, I learned that lesson all the time. I was making potatoes for my son this weekend because it was his birthday and he had some friends over. I made really good burgers, but I wanted to make some just hash browns, and but I also needed to police 5 boys with various sizes of Nerf guns, and that takes a lot of effort, and that really takes you away from the stove. And what happened in that time, of course, is the bottom of the potatoes burned. And I did talk a lot about honesty, but I will be honest with you. No one in my family knows this, and none of you know my family, I hope. It was so mortifying. I truly burned the bottom of these potatoes, and the top was raw. It was not salvageable. I put a top on. The boys were in the kitchen. There are 5 exits from my kitchen. I took the one farthest from where they were. This is in that we have a little farmhouse in the country. I went out the side door and I took them to the pond and I fed them to the ducks. I just couldn't face putting them in the garbage. I couldn't face taking them out of the pan in public. I just couldn't face it. So I blame it on the Nerf battles. It's just to say that, my battle to be a better cook continues, but it's less about technique than just making sure that I'm only doing one thing at a time. So I thought I would open up for questions.
I have 2 questions for you. Who was the cook, the chef that wouldn't work with you? And I get this, you remind me of myself in a way that you have this love-hate relationship with cooking and food and all that stuff. So are you enjoying it now? Where are you going with this?
Okay, well, here's the thing. Let's check the second question first and maybe ignore the first one. I actually don't have a love-hate relationship with food or cooking. And the reason it took me so long was I cook all the time. I mean, I cook for people. I don't do as badly as I did this weekend with my son, those stupid potatoes. But, I mean, I usually will cook for 8 or more. And I have people over all the time, and I quite love it. I mean, I love the shopping. Some people have a problem with shoes. I have a genuine problem with ingredients at farmers markets. Is that a sigh of recognition?
Yeah. She's exhausted already.
I can't pass a carrot without buying it. I can't pass a stand without trying to save a farmer. So I love the shopping. I like the prepping. I'm not so good at the timing, apparently, but I like having people over. I like setting the table. I like encouraging conversations. I like dreaming up the perfect parties in my head and then making them happen. Actually, I love all of that. And though I do, the mistakes are genuine and the failures are true, they're not so bad you can't serve them most of the time, except sometimes to ducks. But so I loved it before. I love it still. I will love it more the better I get. But the thing that I think is the greatest is when you have a genuine freedom to cook and you have tremendous confidence. And so that would be the direction of my cooking, is to have the real freedom. So yeah.
Thank you.
There's another question.
Where you talked about the recipes that you wrote about, and were they yours or were they some of the chefs, or how did you decide what to include in the book?
It's such a good question because it turns out that this is very confusing for people. The recipes are mine. They're mine with some help, to be fair. So I cook all the time from Surprise, Food and Wine magazine, but I also cook from cookbooks. And so a lot of the recipes that I love, that I've adapted, are either from Food and Wine, and chefs who've worked with us said Food and Wine, or from cookbooks that I loved. And as anyone knows, the cookbook recipes, they're sort of owned by the world. So in each case, I would do something to the recipe that made it more mine. And I worked with somebody named Julia Turshin, so we actually had sort of a fun process. I thought it was fun. I came up with the ideas of what I wanted in the recipes, so I would give her what the basis of the recipe was and how I did it myself, how I personalized it. Then she would cook the recipes and write them, and then we had this thing called a TaskRabbit. A TaskRabbit is you go online and you tell someone, you enter in how much you're willing to pay somebody to do your chore. So our chore was to pick up food at Julia's apartment and bring it to my office in Midtown. And so we had a TaskRabbit who came, and they show up, they don't have ears or anything, and they showed up after hours, and I had my team, so the executive food editor and the other editors at Food and Wine, would come and taste my food, and then we would give notes back to Julia, and then she would sort of fix the recipe if it needed fixing, or just write it up, and that was that. And then then I had it cross-tested to be sure, again, that the recipes weren't going to mess you up, because at Food and Wine we do a book called The Best of the Best. It's the best recipes from the best cookbooks of the year. It's an awesome book, but I will tell you, we test 150 cookbooks in a year, and we have a genuinely hard time getting to 25 that are perfectly written, where there aren't errors, usually in timing or amounts or instructions. So I wanted to be sure that that was not going to be a problem with my cookbook, because that would be mortifying. That would be much more mortifying than my not knowing how to cook. Did you have a second question? First was how the recipes.
Yeah, and were any of them yours?
Oh, I see, and the chefs. And so there are a few recipes in here that are fundamentally the chefs, like Mario Batali's. There's a baked ziti arrabbiata that's...
I made that today.
Oh, good. Did you?
Yeah, beautiful.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite recipes in the book, actually, and that's mostly Mario's. Like, I have the tiniest thing to do with it, but it's basically all Mario's. And Andrew Zimmern did a stir-fry recipe with me that is really mostly Andrew. I didn't do a lot to that. It's really good. So there's a couple sprinkled in, but mostly they're mine.
What? Oh, sorry. Somebody else. Yeah.
So another question was, yeah.
Do you have a favorite recipe of all time?
Of all time ever?
Well, maybe, like a favorite chicken recipe or a favorite beef recipe or something. Just, I'm trying to write it down. Yeah.
The chicken in here is one that I love. I guess, weirdly, this is a very, very strange thing. Of all the recipes in the world, there's a fideos recipe in here, which it's my favorite recipe. It's a broken pasta.
Okay. Thank you for explaining.
Yeah, it's like, so you take pasta, you break it, you fry it, and then you simmer it with chorizo and tomato sauce. And it's so satisfying because the pasta, even though you don't think about it this way, the pasta absorbs the liquid. And so instead of tossing your pasta with sauce, it's cooked in it and it absorbs it. And the sauce has so much flavor, and it's been fried, so it's a little crispy and it's like chewy and it has so much flavor. And weirdly, like, of everything, I happen to love this. It's in this book, but I happen to love that fideos recipe. Super simple, as long as you don't do what I did, which is I broke the pasta and it just went everywhere. Someone in the back? Yeah.
I have a question about the Food and Wine event, the yearly event that you guys put.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that? What's the purpose of the event? Anything you want to talk about?
Sure. Well, so Food and Wine magazine has, we participate in 17 events. I'm guessing that the one that you might be thinking of is the Food and Wine magazine Classic in Aspen. Yeah. So we do an event in Aspen every year. It's like the third weekend of June. And we get hundreds of winemakers pouring wine in tents, and we have dozens of chefs who do demos, and it's basically to have the magazine come to life. So you go to Aspen and you get to learn to cook, you get to drink a lot of wine. Aspen has fantastic restaurants, so it's basically so you can experience the magazine in 3 dimensions and you don't have to cook.
Oven temperature, the thermometer, would that be mandatory for most recipes?
It's such a good question. Okay, so an oven thermometer, mandatory for most recipes.
Yeah, I don't have, so I was just wondering why my cooking is like.
Well, you know what? So this was really interesting. I talked to Thomas Keller about oven temperature, the chef at French Laundry in Napa Valley, and then Per Se in New York, and blah, blah. There's a lot of restaurants. But the problem is that what is on your dial, oven dial, or even if it's digital, whatever, it is not really the temperature in every part of your oven. It may be the temperature in one spot in your oven, but everybody knows that ovens have hot spots first. So the reason you want an oven thermometer is you don't want to rely on what it says on the outside, because it's probably not completely correct. And the other thing that you want to do when you're cooking anything, and this is something that I learned through this process because I was really too lazy to turn my pan. There are all these recipes that say, turn the pan in the middle. I'm like, really? Why? But the reason why is to be sure that the heat is even, essentially. Because if you have a hot spot in the back right, and you're making granola, and you turn it in the middle, then what was in the hot corner then comes to the bottom left, and it doesn't get burnt. And so it sort of evens out your oven temperature. It's a way to cheat the thermometer situation. But I would also say finding a good oven thermometer is a worthwhile adventure and not an expensive one. So I would recommend that you do that because it will help safeguard your food.
The internal temperature is what I always go by.
An internal temperature.
Actually, right, even if you want your liquid to be boiling, you want to make sure it's boiling and your food's cooking the right.
So she's saying there's two separate things, and it depends what you're doing, because if you're roasting and you're roasting meat, you want to be concerned with the internal temperature because the rest of the temperature matters some, but not as much as just knowing what like it is at the inside of the thigh. It depends what animal it is, but whatever. But if you're baking, it's not going to really work out for you that way. Yes.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Okay.
What is your husband's and children's favorite recipe? What do they request for you to make them?
My daughter loves soup, but sort of amusingly at this point she likes to correct me. Like last night I made butternut squash soup, and she tasted it and she said, "Would you mind if I worked on this?" So I was about to do many of the things that she did, but I had whisked it and I hadn't quite gotten to the blender yet. But she added olive oil, she added some orange juice, she added some more pepper, and then she put it in the blender. But she always, any soup I make, she likes, and then she likes to correct it. My husband, there's actually 1 or 2 recipes that are from him. He does a really fun. He does a fun soup. But the thing that he loves that I make is a steak au poivre. So he actually doesn't eat a whole lot of meat. So I think it's really special when,
You do potatoes on the side with that.
Yeah, I could. Yeah, he doesn't eat potatoes.
Do
Luckily.
you use a convection oven? I mean, do you put it on convection or regular?
I don't. I use a straight on oven. I don't use convection. I feel like I don't understand the convection enough and its effect, and I have enough problems without it. So, no. Yeah.
So what are you doing for Thanksgiving 2014?
I hate to say it, but I'm going to my mother's. She's getting takeout from Mitchell London. There's going to be a really big spread of dessert. And I mean, the only time I ever switched up Thanksgiving was when I said to my mother, none of the kids, and so I have 2, my brother has 3, and there's another brother has 1. So there's 6 children. They hate Thanksgiving food, which I kind of understand. It's bland. It's not the type of food they eat all the time. And I said to my mother, how would you feel if I'll buy it myself, if I brought some lamb chops and I just seared them and the rest of the meal was the same, but we just they didn't have to eat the turkey. And very, very, very begrudgingly, she said yes to the lamb chops. Well, the kids love the lamb chops. And then the grown-ups wanted the lamb chops. And then my mother she was infuriated. She'd spent all this time planning, talking to Mitchell London. And what am I doing what am I doing? I've got lamb chops. So the next year, she told me, just so you know, there's no lamb chops this year. Number 1, your children can go hungry. Number 2, if they don't want to go hungry, I've really bulked up on the hors d'oeuvre. There's a lot of shrimp. There's a lot of cheese. There's a lot of sausage. There's a lot of nuts. And then there's dessert. So if they don't want to have Thanksgiving, they're going to be just fine. And so that's, so we're doing my mother's Thanksgiving. Is that? So, and we're gonna, and it's about to be Thanksgiving. I will say that in Food and Wine magazine, I did a story based on the book with Jonathan Waxman, who's an amazing chef in New York. He has a restaurant called Barbuto, and he helped me in the book with fixing my turkey. But the recipes that are in the magazine and that aren't in the book are really, really, they're fantastically simple and delicious Thanksgiving dishes. You can go online and get them if you want. I think the magazine's still on the newsstand, but you can go online and get them too. And the magical dish in that whole set of dishes, the gravy's amazing. Again, Jonathan, so we were all prepped with my gravy recipe, and Jonathan walked in and he goes, why exactly are you doing it that way? And he said, how much time do you have? And we told him, he's like, let's start over. Do you have an onion? And so we did the whole thing again, and it is the most delicious gravy that does not rely on pan drippings because I can never get them. So it's a pan drippingless gravy. But there's a pumpkin tiramisu that is to die for if anyone's looking for a really great Thanksgiving dessert, because Thanksgiving's coming. So thank you very much. Thank you to the library for having me.